Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to be diving deep today into something that's probably on a lot of your minds, what a Donald Trump victory could actually mean for America. You guys sent in some seriously interesting articles and research, and it's wild how many different views there are out there.
hmm
Some people think Trump could bring about some really positive changes, while others are seriously worried about what it could mean for the world, you
hmm
know, like global stability. So let's break it all down together. We're going to look at both sides, the good and the bad, and really focus in on things like domestic policy, what it means for the economy, how it affects society, and yeah, even how it could impact relationships with other countries.
It definitely gets people talking,
Yeah.
that's for sure. I think one of the most interesting things about Trump is how he seems to connect with people outside the usual political circles.
Right, like he speaks to people who feel like the system's failed them.
Exactly. People who feel like nobody's listening to them. And that connection that he builds, that's a huge part of what some call Trumpism. It's not just about him as a person. It's about this whole movement fueled by this idea of populism, this desire for big changes.
And we saw that play out during his first time as president.
Mm.
He shook things up, especially with how he used the media.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I
I
mean,
don't
his
know.
communication style was totally different, especially his use of social media.
It was like he was going around the usual channels and talking straight to people.
He absolutely was. It was this direct, no filter style, often through Twitter. And it really resonated with people who felt ignored by the regular news outlets. And it's a trend we're seeing with other populist leaders all over the world, too.
You know, that actually reminds me of something in one of the articles you sent, this one from Name of Journal. It talked about how Trump's rise to power happened alongside this global surge in populism and nationalism. You know, with leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, they were using similar tactics and rhetoric.
Right. And this trend towards populism, it kind of goes hand in hand with Trump's America First agenda.
Oh, for sure.
Remember back in his first term when he pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement and then he renegotiated NAFTA? His whole goal was to put America's economic interests first. And if he wins again, we'll likely see those America First policies continue, maybe even get stronger.
So let's dig into what a second term for Trump could actually mean for America.
Yeah.
You included some sources that were really focused on the potential economic benefits that his supporters talk about, especially when it comes to his economic policies.
Yeah, a lot of Trump supporters, they look at the economic growth during his first term as proof that his policies work. And there are actual numbers to back that up. That report you shared from the Tax Foundation.
Yeah.
It showed that his big tax cut plan, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, well, it actually lowered the corporate tax rate. The idea was that this would encourage businesses to invest more.
And did that actually happen? Like, did businesses actually invest more?
Well, the data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that you sent suggests that business investment did increase after the tax cuts, but whether that was directly because of the tax cuts or because of other things going on at the time, well, that's still up for debate.
Okay, interesting. So there's a connection there at least.
Yeah.
And what about all his efforts to reduce regulations? What impact did those have?
That's where things get a little more complicated.
Mm.
One of the reports you sent, it was a study from the Brookings Institution, argued that while getting rid of some regulations might have helped the economy in the short term,
Okay.
it could also have made things less stable financially and even put consumers at risk.
So it sounds like it's a bit of a trade-off. Trying to boost the economy might mean taking risks with financial stability and consumer safety.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big part of the whole debate around Trump's economic policies. There were definitely some gains, but are those gains going to last? And are the benefits being spread fairly? Those are some of the questions that are still out there.
Right, because a growing economy doesn't always mean that everyone's life is getting better. Now, you also included some articles about Trump's promises to bring back American manufacturing and create jobs. That seems to be a big part of why people support him, especially in areas where manufacturing jobs have disappeared.
Absolutely. His focus on Made in America and his work to change trade deals are all about relying less on foreign manufacturing, especially from China. The goal is to make it more attractive for companies to bring production back to the U.S. and create more jobs for American workers, especially in those blue-collar industries.
And one of the articles you sent from the Wall Street Journal, it said that his tariffs on Chinese goods were specifically designed to do just that. But isn't there another side to that too? Didn't those tariffs also make things more expensive for people buying stuff?
Yes, that's an important point. While tariffs can be a way to protect industries here in the U.S., they can also mean higher prices for consumers and businesses that need to import goods. And that's where things get messy, because in these trade wars, there are often winners and losers.
So it's not as easy as just bringing back jobs and making America great again. There's a lot of complicated economics at play, and you can't always predict what's going to happen. Now, something else that's important to Trump supporters is immigration. You highlighted this in the sources you picked.
Yeah, and there's this article you shared. It's from the Center for Immigration Studies. They're a think tank that wants less immigration. They argue that we need stricter immigration policies to protect American jobs and resources.
They say that immigration, especially people coming here illegally, puts a strain on our social services and drives down wages for American workers.
Exactly. And they often point to border security and national security as reasons to tighten immigration control. You'll remember that during his first term, Trump made border security a top priority, pushing to build that wall along the U.S.-Mexico border.
And that wall became a really powerful symbol, both for his supporters and for the people who opposed him.
Totally. It was like a physical representation of his America First approach.
Yeah.
This barrier meant to control who and what could cross the border.
So we've talked about the economy and immigration, two areas where Trump supporters see a lot of potential. But there's another side to this too, right? This idea that Trump represents a certain set of social and cultural values, values that some feel are under attack.
Right. And you included some sources that reflect that view. For example, there's this op-ed from Name of Source called Title of Article that argues that Trump is a strong defender of traditional family values, religious freedom, and the right to bear arms.
And these are values that seem to really resonate with a lot of people, especially those who feel like the country is moving away from its traditional roots.
Exactly. And those values, they translate into support for policies that reflect those beliefs. You pointed out a policy brief from the Heritage Foundation. It's a conservative think tank, and they're pushing for things like stricter abortion laws, school choice programs that include religious schools, and a strong defense of Second Amendment rights.
And it's important to remember that for a lot of Trump supporters, these aren't just abstract political issues. They're deeply held beliefs that shape how they see the world and their place in it.
That's a really important point. These are issues that touch on identity and belonging. And for many people, Trump represents a return to those values, values they believe are fundamental to what America is all about.
Okay, so we spent some time looking at the potential upsides, the good things that some people see in a Trump presidency. But as we know, there's another side to this coin, and we're going to dive into those concerns. The potential threats that a Trump presidency might bring right after this. So we just explored some of the potential opportunities that people see with the Trump presidency, especially around the economy and social values. But now let's look at the other side. What are some of the concerns that people have raised? And based on the sources you shared, you seem to have some of these concerns as well. These concerns seem to go deeper than just specific policies. They touch on the core of American democracy and its future.
Yeah, that's right. There's this underlying worry about Trump's leadership style and how it could affect our democratic norms and institutions. This was a big theme throughout his first term.
You specifically included a report from the Brennan Center for Justice that lays out some of these concerns. It highlighted times when Trump seemed to challenge the legitimacy of the election process even before the 2020 election.
Yes, and that report, along with a bunch of articles you sent, all focus on how Trump repeatedly questioned the integrity of elections. It all culminated in what happened on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol. These actions really raise concerns about whether he respects the peaceful transfer of power, which is like a fundamental principle of democracy.
And this erosion of trust in the election process is something a lot of people worry could continue or even get worse if Trump is elected again.
Absolutely. And it's not just about elections, it's about other democratic institutions, too. Remember how he kept attacking the media, calling them the enemy of the people?
Yeah.
That kind of rhetoric can really undermine press freedom, which is so important for holding those in power accountable.
You even sent me an academic study that looked at this exact thing. It argued that Trump's constant attacks on the media led to a decline in public trust in journalism and made it easier to dismiss critical reporting as fake news.
That's a key point. And it goes beyond the media, too. Think about all his clashes with the intelligence community and the judicial system. He often seemed to see these institutions, which are designed to keep the executive branch in check, as obstacles in his way.
You sent an opinion piece from Name of Source that talked about this directly. It expressed concern about the potential for a president to ignore court rulings or undermine the independence of law enforcement.
Exactly. And this disregard for norms and institutions is a major red flag for those who worry about authoritarian tendencies.
So there are serious concerns about the potential impact on our democratic institutions. But what about the social fabric of America? Could a Trump victory further divide and polarize us?
That's a very real worry, and it's something you've highlighted by including reports from organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. These reports show an increase in hate crimes and extremist activity during Trump's first term, and they argue that his rhetoric emboldened these groups.
It's like his language, which often targeted specific groups or individuals, created an environment where intolerance and hostility felt more acceptable, more normal.
Right. And even if he tones things down, the divisions he's already revealed in American society run very deep. Bridging those divides and finding common ground is going to be a huge challenge.
And it's tough because even talking about these concerns can feel divisive in itself. It's
Yeah.
like we're trying to walk this fine line, having a nuanced conversation about real anxieties without making things worse.
That's the challenge with discussing such a polarizing figure. But it's crucial to acknowledge that these concerns exist and to understand why people feel this way.
For sure. Now, shifting to the global stage, you sent over some interesting stuff about the potential international consequences of a Trump presidency. A big theme seems to be his America First approach and how that translates into foreign policy.
Yeah, and an article from the Council on Foreign Relations argues that Trump's skepticism of international alliances and agreements could weaken America's position globally and create instability in key regions.
They mentioned things like his withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership
Mhm.
and the Paris Climate Agreement as examples.
Mm.
And there's also the concern about his approach to trade, right? Those tariffs he imposed on goods from China and other countries.
Exactly. Those tariffs were meant to protect American industries and jobs, but they also created tension with our trading partners and contributed to global economic uncertainty. It's a complex issue with effects that ripple throughout the world economy.
Almost like a domino effect, where one action leads to a chain reaction that's difficult to predict and even harder to control. And speaking of unpredictable situations, what about the impact on global efforts to fight climate change? You sent over a bunch of reports from environmental organizations that are deeply concerned about another Trump term.
These reports, especially the one from the Climate Action Tracker, point to Trump's rollback of environmental regulations and his withdrawal from the Paris Agreement as major setbacks in the fight against climate change.
They say his actions hurt global efforts to reduce greenhouse gases and sent a message that the U.S. wasn't leading on this issue anymore.
And there's this fear that another Trump term would lead to even more deregulation and continued reliance on fossil fuels, which would make the climate crisis even worse.
So globally, there are worries about America's role in the world, its commitment to working with other countries, and its leadership in tackling global problems like climate change.
It's a web of interconnected issues, and the potential fallout from a Trump presidency goes way beyond U.S. borders.
Okay, we've covered a lot exploring both the potential positives and negatives of a Trump presidency. Now let's step back and imagine what those different futures might actually look like. Let's play out some hypothetical scenarios, best case and worst case, just to get a better sense of what a second Trump term could mean for America and the world. Okay, so we've looked at the potential ups and downs, the good and the bad that could come with a Trump presidency. Now let's try to picture what a second term for him could actually look like. Of course, trying to predict the future is, well, kind of impossible, especially when it comes to politics. But by thinking through some what-if scenarios, we can at least get a sense of what might happen.
Right. It's not like the future is already written. It depends on a lot of things. What political leaders do, how the public reacts, even unexpected things happening around the world.
Right, so let's start by imagining the best-case scenario. Let's say everything goes Trump's way in his second term. What could that look like based on the sources you shared?
Well, in this optimistic scenario, those economic benefits that his supporters talk about actually happen in a big way. You included an economic forecast from the American Enterprise Institute. It's a pretty conservative group. And they suggest that under the right circumstances, Trump's policies could lead to a big surge in economic growth.
So we're talking like a booming stock market, low unemployment, maybe even a comeback for manufacturing jobs.
Exactly. And in this best case scenario, that prosperity spreads through society, people's standard of living goes up, maybe even income inequality goes down.
And maybe, just maybe, some of that political division we talked about starts to fade away because people are feeling more secure and optimistic about the future.
Yeah, it's possible. Imagine Trump supporters feeling like their faith in him was justified and some of his critics being willing to admit that there were some positive outcomes.
Okay, so that's the rosy picture. But let's be real. Things don't always go as planned. What about a less optimistic scenario? What if things go wrong?
That's when those potential threats we discussed could become a bigger problem. One of the articles you sent It was from the Atlantic expressed concern that if Trump isn't kept in check, he might continue to erode democratic norms and try to grab more power.
So are we talking about possible conflicts with Congress?
Hmm.
Him trying to get around checks and balances? Maybe even further erosion of trust in the courts and the press?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
could happen. And socially, those divisions we talked about could get even worse, leading to more polarization and maybe even unrest.
You included a report from the Pew Research Center that shows just how divided America is along political lines. Imagine those divisions getting even deeper, making it almost impossible to find common ground or compromise on important issues.
It's a scary thought. And then there's the international scene. What if Trump's America First approach makes the U.S. more isolated and damages relationships with our allies?
There's a policy brief you shared from the Center for American Progress that warns about the potential for global instability if the U.S. steps back from its leadership role. They say this could make our adversaries bolder and make it harder to deal with challenges like climate change and terrorism.
Exactly. And if Trump keeps downplaying the threat of climate change and puts short-term economic gains ahead of protecting the environment, the consequences could be really bad both here and around the world.
So in this less optimistic scenario, we're looking at a future with more tension here at home, instability globally, and maybe even a faster-moving climate crisis.
It's not a pretty picture, but it's something we have to think about. The choices our leaders make, what we do as citizens, and all those unpredictable global events, they'll all have a part in shaping what happens next.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, and I know it can feel overwhelming, but that's why these deep dives are so important. By looking